CAPSI podcast series, Conversations on African Philanthropy.
Welcome to our Conversations on African Philanthropy with me, Prof Moyo, the Director of the Center on African Philanthropy and Social Investment here at the First Business School in Johannesburg, South Africa. I'm very excited to be joined by my friend, a colleague and a brother of mine, Tendai Murisa, who is currently the Executive Director of SIVIO Institute. Tendai, welcome.
Thank you so much for having me, Prof.
In fact, I was deliberate to say I'm joined by my friend, my colleague, and my brother.
Sure.
Because you and I come long way.
Sure.
And I want us to, start maybe from the past and come to where we are.
Sure.
I always jokingly, maybe I'll be making a light moment about us and, how we got to work together closely.
Sure.
And I always say to people, there was a time when the country was going through a crisis in Zimbabwe, and I happened to be working for Trust Africa, and I was supporting one of the institutions here that was doing some work on elections. And we had this meeting in Mozambique, and I say to people, I listened to this young man then speaking passionately but eloquently about agriculture, making it so exciting. A subject that for most people would be such a boring subject because of what people make of it.
Sure.
But you made it sound so exciting. Maybe let's start there and talk about, your work around agriculture or agricultural studies, from the perspective of civil society, as a scholar, but also your role and work that you did at the center then,
Okay.
which has now become the SIVIO Institute for Agrarian Studies.
Okay, thanks. Yeah, it takes us a long way back. But I think, and I'm grateful that we're starting there. I think the whole conversation we had in Mozambique, yes, the backdrop was the Zimbabwe crisis, but we're trying to locate smaller crises within the big crisis. And at that moment, and even up to now, we're grappling with the issue around the land question.
Yeah.
And how it was panning out in Zimbabwe. And I think, for me, I always tell people that my background is actually not agriculture, but political science, and then development studies and raw sociology. So within those lands, when you're looking at the raw question, you look at power, you look at distribution of resources, etc. And I like the fact that when you came and you made that connection, I remember the next time we're sort of grappling with how both our theses, it looked as if they were different,
Yeah.
but they were talking about the same thing.
Yeah.
I had looked at rural agency, how communities come together to forge livelihoods and to also organize themselves in response to the crisis they face. Then, as we were talking, you also revealed what you were studying, and we realized that we're probably talking about the same thing. You were calling it philanthropy,
Yeah.
I was calling it agency.
Yeah.
But in essence, we're talking about how people respond and also how people collectively produce value, social goods, etc. So I think that has been the journey since then around saying we're coming from what may look like distant or separate disciplines, but there's a common link in our work.
Yeah, and of course there have been lots of experimentations, if I may say.
Yeah.
And one of them, I'll get a bit personal, but one of them has to do with the fact that at that time you were at the center that was run by our late brother, father, but also mentor, Professor Moyo. And at that time, fast forward a bit after our meeting in Mozambique, we're at Trust Africa. Then we get, approached by the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation to run a program on agriculture and advocacy. And of course, I come back to look for you, and you were finalizing your PhD then at Rhodes University.
Sure.
But we experimented with something then, and I keep thinking back about what we're trying to do and how maybe as many institutions we probably don't do enough of it.
Sure.
Which is that you look at two institutions on the African continent that might be working on probably close or similar issues. Look at where we want to position the people who are working in there in the near future and think about how these institutions can do together. In our case, we went to Prof Moyo and said, is it possible for us to have Tendai do almost like 40% institute and maybe 60% Trust Africa. Mm-hmm. And we experimented on that for almost a year and a half, if I remember very well. Mm-hmm. I mean, when I think back, probably it was a knee-jerk reaction from myself and those that were Trust Africa to go that route. But when I think back, I actually realized that, if we had many institutions that could do that and maybe put aside some of the interests, organizational interests that you just want to focus on yourself only, we could go a long way. Maybe as somebody who went through that, you at the center of it. What are your reflections on that experiment, but also having the benefit of experience now? Would it have been done differently?
Yeah, in hindsight, I think it's always good to reflect in hindsight. It was a great idea. I think Trust Africa was years ahead in terms of thinking around collaboration, how to partner with other African institutions, beyond just grant making, but to begin to say, how do we really establish? Because for you, I think the recognition at that time, the leadership at Trust Africa was recognizing that here is a skill that is resident in another organization, but we don't want to poach. We want to also benefit, but we also want to make sure that maybe we create a synergy. But at times, institutions miss that. Like you're saying, at times we narrowly understand how to utilize human resources. While it's actually we could do more with those synergistic sort of approaches if we really begin to think that some skills may be resident in one organization, but they are not being fully utilized. Or they could actually be then transported to another organization to help build skills in that other organization. So like I said, Trust Africa at that particular moment, I would say, was 10 years ahead of the game. Collaboration, the way you were thinking of framing collaboration was actually influenced by even the philanthropy that you're talking about. To say the paradigm of philanthropy we're talking about is just not about money, but it's also about how we can create these interlocking relationships, the exchange that go as far as exchanging skills, etc. So we do not do it more often than we should, but it was definitely an idea that was ahead of its time, and it's still worth pursuing, given the challenges that we have right now. To say you may find an organization with so many resident specialist services, but not fully utilizing them.
Yeah, and of course we should pay tribute to Professor Moyo. You and I and many others were mentored by him, but you in particular, because if there's, I dare say this, that if there's anyone that he probably handed the torch on to continue the work on agriculture, it's probably you and the colleagues at his institute. Sure. Before we leave this area of agriculture, you are probably one of the very few that have written extensively on agriculture, the land question, civil society and rural participation in all of these issues. Are there specific insights that probably in the last couple of years that you've been working in the space you would want to maybe package and speak on?
Yeah, I think it's credit to Sam. Prof for me was more than just a boss. He was a mentor. I think he helped open doors for some of us when we were young, because everywhere you'd go, you're either sent by Sam or you introduce yourself as a colleague who works with Sam. And obviously it helped us develop and establish relationships on the continent. But lately I've been feeling very guilty because I looked at the years. It's been 4 years since I published anything on land and agrarian reform issues, because I've been pursuing other things. But this year is a very special year. I'm working on a tribute to Sam. And I'm looking at the way Sam analyzed it in a book that he did for Codesria, the land and agrarian question in Africa. Because what we have right now, and this is where we would have needed Sam more than at any other time, are the different waves of land grabs. We have a new land grab right now, which is a land grab around what we may call green grabs, where land is being, again, grabbed from Africans. Forests are being grabbed under the basis of carbon credits. Northern polluters are coming to buy land here. They're buying forests. And they're buying forests under the excuse to say that these are unoccupied forests, but shows the lack of understanding of how our people depend on forests without living in those forests. And also, for me, the fascination is this could be maybe another rodeo for me where I combine what I learned from Sam and also what I've been dealing with you, because we are beginning to see a lot of philanthropists investing in this forest.
Yeah.
So we're beginning to look at the relationship between the green grapes and philanthropy. And also beginning to pose new sets of questions around Africa's development. So like I said, it would have been great to collaborate with Sam on this one, but we have to do it for his memory, but also to continue with his legacy.
And of course, I mean, at the moment, as you are saying, there's also, a lot in philanthropy that relates to that. So when you look at the just energy transition, you look at issues around the climate, philanthropy, all of them at times, will coalesce around issues of conservation and issues like that. So it will be very important to not just for purposes of, maybe just that tribute, but how that work could then catalyze everyone across the continent to see these interfaces and intersections. But I don't know if there's anything that you want to say around, philanthropy, climate philanthropy, energy just transitions, and how that would relate to the work that you want to do.
Yeah, it's the contradictions, really. Philanthropy, the face of it is the force for good, and giving grants, doing all good work. Now I'm talking about international philanthropy, coming from the global north, private philanthropy houses. But it's when you begin to look at two things: how they are investing their endowment funds, investing either. We ran a campaign for the past 4 or 5 years. Trust Africa and others were part of that, around looking at investments, beginning to say they should invest out of fossil-related funds, fossil fuel-related funds. That was a phase. But at the moment, we have a new problematic phase around these. You find many philanthropists invested in funds that are buying forests in Africa. So it's already that challenge to say, on the one hand, they are fighting us to create advocacy mechanisms against this, but from their private investments or their endowments. So the question has always been to say, to what extent do philanthropy houses have a coherent understanding of the work they are doing in terms of their footprint? So on the one hand, from their grant giving, they are doing this work that they are helping organizations in the global south, in Africa, to be a defense mechanism against some harmful practices of capital. But also, when now they invest their endowments, they are also investing in those problematic spaces. So I think, and I'm hoping, because the data I've looked at is actually beginning to help us to map this has always been the challenge about living philanthropists. So begin to map their investments and their contradictions, etc. So I think it will help us to shape the narrative, again, to come back as African advocates for a better positioned philanthropy space or philanthropy posture, to begin to expose these inconsistencies and hopefully shape the sort of the way in which philanthropy is active in our landscape.
I want to fast forward a bit to the time that then you are at Trust Africa. You are now managing this program that was focusing on agricultural advocacy, working mainly with most of the civil society organizations in the continent, some of them social movements, and of course the project was funded then by the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. And you and I can speak openly about the contradictions of philanthropy. Because that project, for me, was one of the most important projects on the continent, but it was also one of the projects that had contradictions in terms of, just the positioning of it, the framing, but also things that, how some social movements actually perceived it. I remember some social movements in Tanzania and others struggling to actually accept the funding that came from the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. So we can reflect on that, because we have been there. You and I have been there. We have been with these social movements. We've been these organizations. But at the same time, we've also been with the donors trying to open up opportunities for funding. What are some of the opportunities and contradictions that you see in philanthropy, but using that project as a framework?
You remember that I was the first one to have problems with the funds. So I remember writing a big piece around it. It's got the challenges around perception, etc. But I must also say and give credit to especially the colleagues at the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation at that time. They proved to us, all of us at Trust Africa at the moment, the way they worked with us. They never set an agenda for us. They allowed us. They were involved, but they allowed us to lead.
Yeah.
And compared with other donors we were working with, they were not as involved, or they were not leading in terms of decision making. So I think that sort of softened what we thought was going to be problematic. But at that time, if you remember very well, we're dealing with challenges to do with what people thought is some form of modernization of agriculture around imposition of certain kinds of GMO seeds on the continent, etc. And so there was resistance on the part of social movements. But for us, we're going to those social movements, and we're saying we're prepared to have this discussion, because that particular initiative was shaped around influencing the African Union and the African countries around increasing their allocations towards agriculture. So we stayed true to that course to say we are focused on making sure that countries are allocating 10%, and we are also focused on sharpening advocacy capabilities within the partners that we're working with. So in terms of our footprint and the work we're doing in the 6 and 8 countries that we then did was really high. And if you remember the second round, they actually increased the funds. And we also found ourselves doing, and I think even up to now, some of those who know about our work remember that particular moment, despite its challenges, like I've said. So I think it was based on the urgency within Trust Africa to begin to say, okay, we've got this fund. It has certain perceptions out there about how but we made sure that we did not push the brand of the funder, but we pushed our brand. And at that moment, we were a trusted convener across the continent. So people would accept our resources because we gave them the assurances that there will not be any meddling from the donor maybe you have challenges with.
And I think it's important that you put it that way, because in most cases, big philanthropy is, when it comes to the space, the first reaction from people around is that this big philanthropy is coming with an agenda, and therefore the immediate reaction is to either fight it or to resist and all of that. But I think what that program tried to do was to really work with communities, especially social movements, to focus their attention, like you said, on this 10% thing that was an AU declaration. And we needed to actually focus on that. I think I want to stick a bit on the Trust Africa side, because I think, if there's one institution on the continent that has elevated the promotion of philanthropy, equitable development, governance, it has been Trust Africa. And of course, there are many others. I'm not taking away from them. So you stay on and you get involved in other projects at Trust Africa, but essentially you end up becoming the executive director of Trust Africa. And as I look back and reflect, I remember a conversation that I had with Sam when we were beginning the conversation about you joining Trust Africa. And the conversation with Sam was, can we have Tendai come and join Trust Africa? And Sam saying, but why would I do that? Because I want him here. And my issue with Sam was, so what do you want him to be? Sam says, I want him to come and run the center.
The center, yes.
And I say to Sam, okay, but don't you think it would be nice to actually have him work at a Pan-African level? And then once he's gained this experience, he can come back and become the director of your center. And that was the point where Sam actually said, okay, let's do it. But instead of becoming the executive director of Sam Center, you became Trust Africa executive director. And for me, that was really fascinating, because it gave us an opportunity to still have this Pan-African look on things. And by then, not only were you a specialist on agriculture, but you are also now a specialist on philanthropy and all the related issues that are there. Maybe let's reflect on that period of your time at Trust Africa leading up to becoming the executive director.
I always say to people that I became the executive director by accident. Because in terms of career paths, it looked like it was for you. You were, at that moment, before you left Trust Africa to join Southern Africa Trust, you were leading programs. And there was a career path. I remember conversations that you were supposed to be appointed deputy director, then executive director. But when you got the opportunity at Southern Africa Trust to be closer to family, etc., there was a vacuum. And in that particular vacuum, I remember initially standing in as the interim programs director.
Yeah.
Then I never really stayed for long as programs director. I don't remember if I became substantive program director.
Yeah.
Then there were interviews for the job to be executive director. I think the first round, they didn't find a suitable candidate. Then they opened it up to internal staff.
Yeah.
Then I got the job. But for me, like I said, I was an executive director by accident because it was never an intentional path.
Yeah.
But by that time, I sort of grown beyond agriculture. We're beginning to connect development questions. I had been asked to lead the initiative on illicit financial flows out of Africa, etc., working with the Ford Foundation and also working with many other centers. And if I remember very well, we were the first ones again to lead that program. So I remember when I would be talking to potential grantees, first of all, I'll spend time trying to explain what illicit financial flows were.
Yeah.
Because others were sort of reducing them to issues to do with tax justice, etc. Then we began to explain, no, actually Africa is losing more money, etc. But at that time, you're connecting these issues to say, we have a challenge of illicit financial flows. We have a challenge of mobilizing our own resources through what we're calling philanthropy. And we have a challenges or crisis of reproduction in agriculture. Mining is bleeding money, etc. So by the time you then sort of take over the leadership of an institution like Trust Africa, you have this understanding and also the agency related to it.
Yeah.
So I remember my first big undertaking was to host the African Higher Education Summit. Again, looking at it from a resourcing perspective, that was our angle to say, how do we resource African higher education? So we're trying to make sure that we're having conversations with philanthropists, conversations with governments, etc. But at the center of it all, this is what I'd learned by now, to say, in whatever we're doing, we're trying to build African agency.
Yeah.
So that's another fascinating aspect about Trust Africa, that when we could talk about wicked problems facing the continent, but that's not where we ended. Our focus was on saying, how do we build African agency to resolve or to respond to these problems? So then we're beginning to gather momentum around those sides of problems to begin to say, how do we make sure that philanthropy is a cross-cutting theme around all these? And our appreciation of philanthropy was both global and African. We appreciated both, and we begin to say we need to be harnessing both because the job is too big. I remember that we would even have huge debates within Trust Africa itself around the agenda of donors, etc. But we had come to learn that just bring it. We'll have the urgency of making sure that this money is utilized for greater goals.
For me, at that point, as you are speaking, I'm remembering now things coming vividly because for me, this has been many, many years ago. But at that point, we actually had several initiatives. If you remember, we had the investment, climate, and business environment. We had obviously the philanthropy initiative. We had the criminal, was it called the criminal justice initiative? That had a whole lot of donors.
Transitional justice.
It became transitional justice. We had a program on religion that we were working on, where we brought the pastor and the imam, etc. So
and
all
these, the MDG3.
and the MDG3, all these programs. And what for me taught me was programming first, how to program, but secondly, grant making as a science and an art. And we pay very little attention to grant making in most of the cases. We think money just goes out. But there's a lot that goes into it, and we have learned a lot of lessons out of grant making. But I also think it was also an important moment for us to just understand the position that institutions like Trust Africa and others actually occupy in the continent. So I've used that, from Trust Africa to the Southern Africa Trust, and now to actually today. And then fate happens. Your term to Trust Africa comes to an end, and is surrounded by all sorts of unfortunate events. One of them is the loss of your mother, but the other is just things that are not expected from a governance point of view. And we have this period where it's a bit of a challenging moment for you. But out of that, SIVIO is born. Maybe let's talk about that moment and the birth of SIVIO.
I think it's Well, it's a very difficult chapter because it coincides with somebody was asking me about trigger moments, and I said to them an event called Mother's Day and another one being the board. It's, like I said, very unfortunate because I think there was a lot that was lost in translation. It could have been handled better, but here we are now. I think at that particular moment was, if you look at it, this is 2017, starting from around March all the way maybe into December. So it's a moment to pause. Not that you've decided to pause, but life forces you to pause. And you're trying to say, because we'd been racing, we've been running, build upon the legacy of the first director, etc. We're really doing a lot of things. We'd managed to purchase a property for Trust Africa, and we thought we were doing very well, but others had other thoughts. So by the time you then settle down to realize, okay, this is what has happened, and I've lost a parent, the only parent I had at that time. And also, interestingly, I also had a daughter who had been born same year. So you're looking at this child and thinking, I'm going to look after this child when I'm unemployed. So she's only 2 or 3 months old. So it's, but I think if there's anything that is important or that one should be grateful for, is these dark days. Because dark days mean that there's going to be brighter days ahead of us. So if you were to ask me now, I would even say I'm grateful for the decisions that were made, because it helped me maybe to unlock purpose at a certain level. Because I think our purposes as individuals are not locked to organizations. You can achieve your purpose through many containers. So organizations are containers that help us to achieve our purpose. So I think my life purpose is as an agent of transformation and change and empowerment. So I spent time in Zimbabwe, received a couple of offers from donor organizations, but we just felt like we're not comfortable to leave Zimbabwe. We just stayed there. I accepted a fellowship to be in the US, but before I went for my fellowship, Zimbabwe happened. November 17 happened. We had a coup, that others don't call a coup. At that moment, when people were calling me, asking me, I actually realized that as I was writing to them what needs to be done from a civil society perspective, somebody else says, but Chief, do you realize that what you're asking for does not exist? So I actually began to realize a niche for SIVIO. But truth be told, I'd already registered SIVIO, but as an advisory social enterprise. I had said to myself, I don't want to do anything big. I'll just do a one-man show, provide support to organizations, etc. But given that moment and the excitement around possibilities of change in Zimbabwe, I saw the need to establish an institute. And SIVIO, by the way, is names to do with my mother. So it's a very personal project that I sort of have devoted time towards, just to make sure that we build an organization. But because of my mother's passion around young girls, etc., you find that almost all our leadership positions are occupied by young women, etc. So we're trying to really push and make sure that they're empowered, etc. And I've been pleasantly surprised in the past couple of months when I go to meetings that there's now brand visibility. People recognize the work we're doing, etc. So, but it's been a lot of work.
It is. But also at that time, I remember you had just done a book on Zimbabwe's crisis. And that coincided with the idea of an institute. But also, I think at some point you have said to me that what is in the book is actually
what we then implemented.
Maybe let's talk about that book and how it translates into the institute.
So it's called Beyond the Crisis, Prospects for Zimbabwe's Transformation. So this is a 2015 publication. We gathered quite a number of young scholars that were not yet published well, and we brought them together. And we said, let's think through what it would take or what would happen if there was an opportunity to move the needle in Zimbabwe. What would be the things that we need to put in place? So people spoke about what needs to be resolved around land, what needs to be resolved in climate, what needs to be resolved in business, what needs to be resolved in education, in social service delivery. So we got all these ideas packaged in a book. It was sort of a manifesto. But for all of us, we did not know when that moment would be. So maybe with the change in government that happened, we thought that maybe this could be it. So when I get the opportunity now to set up the institute, I'm not looking for new information because I already have the manual, which is the book. So we convert that manual into the strategy of the organization to say, we are going to focus on a citizen-centered process of change, where we're looking at saying one center is focused on philanthropy and communities. So we're talking of this horizontal philanthropy, how communities come together to mobilize resources. Another center is focused on civic engagement, where we're focusing on empowering citizens to be part of public discussions, etc. But it's also in the book. Then we're also looking at social entrepreneurship, etc. So I think it was serendipity, things that you were not expecting, but you're sort of ready for them if they were to happen. That's exactly what happened with us.
Yeah, and of course, I think the most important thing here is that out of what seemed to be a crisis and a dark moment, both at a personal level and at a national level, translates into what is now SIVIO, with now this brand visibility, doing lots of amazing work on all these centers that we're speaking about. One of which is to do with, I remember launching SIVIO in Harare.
Yes.
And then I think one of the main issues was around what are people's views on different political parties and their manifestos. The citizen, what is it called? Citizen
perceptions and
perceptions index. So maybe we can talk a bit about some of the interventions and some of the flagship programs that you are currently working on and that SIVIO is focused on.
Yeah. So this was based on my understanding of the funding terrain, that you are going to have to do big things with modest resources. So the first strategy we had was to say, how are we going to leverage technology? So in leveraging technology, we began to say, how do we track promises made by a political party before it gets into power during election cycles? So we created what we call the ZimCitizensWatch.org, which is actually an online-based tracker of the conversion, in the extent to which government is converting its electoral promises into actions. So I'm glad that that work has now expanded. We are now doing that in Zambia and in Malawi, and we've just secured funding to expand into Ghana and also into Botswana. The reason why we're expanding into Ghana, Botswana, and Malawi and Zambia was because there's another hypothesis we're testing. This is a hypothesis to say democratic governments, and these are countries that are able to change political parties at almost every election. This is what happened in Zambia and in Malawi. You have a better chance of delivering on the electoral promises they're making. It's a hypothesis, so we're testing it. Because what we're seeing and is worrying on the continent is to say, when you're looking at countries that are doing well in terms of economic development, they are not necessarily fitting the bill of what you may call democratic. This is Rwanda, this is Ethiopia. So we're beginning to say, no, but we've got some bright shoots around countries that are managing their elections well and changing governments peacefully. But we're now trying to track to say, are they able to convert the electoral promises they make into policy actions? So that's one. And we've then set up another center around philanthropy where we're beginning to say, we want to contribute towards building new sites or new centers of philanthropy, starting off in Zimbabwe. In a couple of, I think 2 months ago, we helped set up the Zimbabwe network of community foundations. So I think that is a very important thing, because when we gathered them, they said, on the one hand, they never saw themselves as a separate entity within civil society, and they never used that term. But when they came together, they realized how the commonalities within their organizations. And we're so excited about that work, and now they can begin to join forces with others in the sub-region, etc. And we're also mobilizing resources, leveraging technology through our Africa Giving platform. We just had an activation in Zimbabwe where we were able to raise, in one sitting, close to 10,000 United States dollars, which we then shared amongst organizations that are listed on that platform. Then we have other initiatives. Most of our research is mostly focused on citizens. What are citizens doing in these spaces, etc. Then we have training. And what we found interesting is that most of our trainings, because we've put it on our virtual platforms, and we've just told people that it exists. We've been deliberate not to push it, but we're looking at the numbers. So there's an appetite amongst activists, development practitioners, to gain skills as they go along.
Yeah.
So we've actually seen the numbers of those people who will plug in and do these courses, etc. So that has been something that has been sort of helping a lot in terms of empowering. For us, it has always been to say we want to work to support those at the front lines of change by making sure that they are well equipped for the work that they are doing.
Yeah. Another piece of work that you are doing, which relates very well to us as CAPSI, is the research on the, I would say maybe regulatory environment for civil society. And I know that you have had reports that have been published, especially focusing on Southern African countries.
Yeah.
And that's an important piece of work, because in most cases, people just want to set up foundations, institutions, without understanding the regulatory requirements and the environment that would then accompany them in their operations, in their programming, etc. Are there some threads that maybe you could want to pull from the reports that you've done?
So that work, I totally agree. It's very important, and we need to keep on updating it.
Yeah.
What we've noticed is, number one, the need to keep on updating this, because the legal space is very dynamic, influenced by different factors. So let me use two countries that we would assume in the SADC region are very democratic, but they are problematic in terms of philanthropy. If you look at Tanzania and if you look at Botswana, Botswana is coming up with laws that have deregistered almost all non-profits as we speak. So people do not realize that what we keep on calling democratic, we are missing that it actually limits association in certain areas. So it's actually how we measure what we call a democratic country. Tanzania, the same. They've imposed limits. Anything about any grant above 10,000 United States dollars, there's a lot of paperwork to fill. You have to say what is the purpose of this funding, etc. In the process, curtailing or limiting possibilities of human rights-focused work, governance-focused work, etc. But people don't pay attention to those things. And of course, there are certain countries that we always knew were going to be problematic. As when Zimbabwe, the government of Zimbabwe has come back again to say they are revisiting the idea of the Private Voluntary Organizations Act. And if implemented, it will make it very difficult for both philanthropy and also the NGO sector to operate freely. So there are all these threats that we are hoping that it's not just a subject matter that is agent to SIVIO, but all of us in the sector, so that we can pull together. Because there's certain things that you actually realize that this needs more than just country level advocacy. So we are hoping that we get to a place whereby we begin to influence SADC around guidelines and also around a barometer, understanding the regulatory environment.
I want us to move to another, maybe last segment of our conversation. But as we were speaking, I just kept wondering, there's something that is triggering me, and I was trying to say, what is it? But it's to do with situations where at the time decisions are taken, and at that time they really don't seem to say anything to us. But later on, when you look back, you realize actually, even though this decision was unfortunate, it actually led to something. So you and I have gone through something almost similar. So in my case, even though you said I was meant to become the director, there were narratives all the time from the governance bodies that, no, this one wants to be a professor, this one. So it delayed my appointment as the director. And an opportunity came for me to then go and direct the Southern Africa Trust and look at where I am now. So one could argue that that narrative that this one wants to be a professor was actually right, because this is where I am now. In your case, again, the same thing that, instead of maybe continuing to the next term, you were let go, but that gave birth to SIVIO. Now we have two institutions in the region that are focusing on philanthropy, and in the last 5 years or so, as you were saying, we have grown them to a point where there's now brand visibility, but they are tangible products that you can show. I don't think we can talk about philanthropy in Southern Africa without making reference to SIVIO or making reference to CAPSI. So I think that was still in my head as we were talking about it, that at times, certain things happen for a reason. We may not see them at that particular moment, but later on, as you look back, you realize maybe this is what was supposed to happen in any case. Otherwise, wouldn't have SIVIO, wouldn't have CAPSI.
True. But I think, just to take you back, I think maybe in many instances we do not pay tribute to how we were sort of raised. So if you look at the role that our executive director at the time, Akwasi played, because Akwasi is responsible not only for birthing Trust Africa, but also for birthing all these institutions. And it's not only CAPSI and SIVIO, it's also Epic Africa, Rosemary. Yeah. So I think without understanding or noticing it, there was something happening. It was a moment, a moment where we're fired up, we had ideas, etc. And maybe Trust Africa by itself would not have been able to sort of unleash all this. Yeah. So when you begin to realize that Trust Africa's role has not just been about funding, but it has also helped to birth institutions. Yeah. Then we celebrate Akwasi and Trust Africa in a different way. But was it done in a proper way? This is the limitation of being human, because we're limited by time. So at times we take decisions that may seem unfair at that particular moment, but over time, like I said, the benefit of hindsight is that we begin to learn a lot, to say, oh, okay, so that moment we were learning. Because for me, I think the major takeaway for me in the institutions that you have made reference to when I was at the African Institute for Agrarian Studies and the Trust Africa, the things that I learned from Sam, that I always tell people that there are things that people saw Sam as a public scholar, but Sam was an administrator par excellence. Sam taught me how to even deal with finances. As a non-finance person, Sam could play around with the budget, look at different ways, etc., etc. Sam taught me also how to structure a funding proposal. But when I went to Akwasi, I learned how to, because when I got to Trust Africa, I was a rabid left academic. But Akwasi taught me about the importance of understanding the position of Africa, because he says, my brother, what we're trying to do here is to make sure we harvest as much as possible the resources coming from anywhere for the benefit of our people. So I began to reduce the ideological rhetoric and to become a bit more pragmatic. So that helped. So by the time I set up SIVIO Institute, I have these experiences, and they helped me a lot in terms of understanding how to set up. So for instance, when I look at SIVIO Institute and the sort of the ecosystem of banking, financial arrangements we have put in place, it's not because I knew these things at the back of my mind when I finished my PhD, but it was about observing what was going on and what needs to be done, etc. And also, by the time we both leave Trust Africa, our Rolodex is so expansive. The network that we have on the continent, almost every country that you enter into, you've got 5 or 6 people that you can call. So you can never take that away from sort of being those intangible but very important assets that you, for a leader, if you're setting up CAPSI, you need.
And so, I mean, as we draw closer to the end, one of the things that you have also done, and you have captured this very well in the interview that you recently did with Trevor Ngobe on the conversation with Trevor. I think family is very huge for you. Obviously, SIVIO, like we said, the patron of SIVIO is your mother, and all of us have really been around that cause. I mean, I've been threatening to leave the board. But because of that figure, it's very hard to just let go of that. But you also have this beautiful letter that you write, to your daughters. I know you've spoken about it in that interview. For those that have not maybe listened to it, maybe you can tell us a bit about, what is the essence of those letters. I know, that you reflect on different, issues, some of them to do with governance, some to do with resourcing, some to do with management, etc. But let's hear it from you, the author of those letters.
It's my daughters are very inquisitive. They ask all sorts of questions. One day I was driving my daughter from school. Then she was sitting at the back. Then she says, Daddy, I get car sick. Then I said, I also used to get car sick when I used to sit at the back, so I don't sit at the back of any vehicle. Then she says to me, did you used to get car sick when your mom was driving you? then already I realized the social dislocation that my daughter had, a misunderstanding of I come from a very working class, working class background.
Yeah.
We're not driven to school, we walked, etc.
Yeah.
So I began to realize the need to say, I need to explain my history to my child.
Yeah.
But even as I was doing that, my child is part of a generation that may not understand or may not connect with the struggles we went through. So I felt like for the benefit, not only of my daughter, but for the others, I'll make these letters public. Because initially I was just writing in a journal. Then I began to think I need to make these letters public. So my daughter one day when she was at school and they were asking about her father, she says, you can Google my dad.
Yeah.
And it helped a lot. So I felt like I lost my dad when I was in Form 1. So even up to now, I don't exactly know what my father wanted me to be. Yeah. And I said this, that half the time, we don't know the time that we have. If I live long enough to see my daughter's children, that is a blessing. Yeah. But if anything was to happen, I hope that my daughter has got a campus that I've provided for her. Yeah. So I posted something yesterday in that letter, which I called Struggle, What Struggle? Yeah. And I was looking at issues to do with different kind of struggles that we face, and the struggles that she will face as a black woman, being raised coming from a country like Zimbabwe, and she'll probably want to compete on the global space. The challenges she will face and the struggles she will face. So trying to prepare again. So for me, it's like to say there are many aspects, but just trying to prepare a worldview to understand the different struggles she'll have to navigate in her life. Yeah. And I think it's very important for those kinds of conversations for my daughter, but also I believe all my nieces and my nephews read it, and at some point they ask me questions around to say, what did you mean by this one, etc. Then we get to start conversations. Yeah.
So I want us to go to the other initiative that you are doing, but let me go back a bit and talk a bit about the work that you did on high net worth individuals, because I think there isn't much that has been written about it, but you have a book that you did on high net worth individuals, but you have also been doing some work also in collaboration with CAPSI on high net worth individuals. Maybe just 1 or 2 points about what you found in that research and in that book.
I think we are not making much of it, but there's a lot around what we can do with African high net worth individuals. Because almost every country that we're seeing, this is the challenge of Africa. We always see the desperation and the poverty, but we miss out on those who are accumulating. We have ultra high net worth individuals who are in the billionaire ranks, but we are not having sufficient conversations with them around how they can begin to sort of contribute to some of these aspirations that we have in Africa. So I'll start off with a contradiction. If you go to, without mentioning names, there are quite a number of high net worth individuals, especially originating from Nigeria, who have made their money in Nigeria, but who are funding universities in America, in the UK. Initially, when I came across that data, I was sort of offended, but I actually began to ask myself, to what extent have we engaged in conversations around making or amplifying the need, and also developing bridges of trust, that they can trust African institutions, that their resources will be used well. In all the interviews that I held with high net worth individuals, one thing that came about to say, trust. So you notice that many of them actually have implementing foundations rather than just funding. So initially, I thought maybe they were being too ambitious. They wanted to do everything. But the challenge is they do not have adequate trust in the institutions we're establishing on the continent. So you begin to ask yourself to say, how do we make sure we bring that to fruition? So I'm glad with the African Philanthropy Conference that you ran together with Trust Africa and others. Because when I saw that one of the partners is African Philanthropy Forum, and it's supposed to be the representative body for them, is to not make sure that we are not just having a conversation with their secretariat, but we find ways of making sure that they participate and they're engaged in our discussions. The few that I sort of provide advisory support to, they take it on board. We are helping a high net worth family, but now they've gone through a bereavement. We're helping them to set up a foundation, but also a cancer research center in Zimbabwe. And what has amazed me is about the levels of trust they've put in us, because we have helped to explain the vision and what they can do. Now we're trying to make sure that we're at the center of creating a catalytic relationship where we bring others on board to support that. But we're trying to make sure that high net worth individuals or high net worth foundations begin to make some big bets on the continent. Because that has been missing because of this perceived challenge to do with trust in our governance.
So finally, I know you've done lots of interviews and people can actually look at that. Like your daughter said, they can Google you. We can do the same. But what if? What if?
So what if comes from, and you'll be surprised, Peggy, what if comes from a blog I wrote when I started experimenting with blogging. I think it was in 2013. I was a program officer at Trust Africa. I wrote a what if. I had just been taught how to set up my own blog. And I sent it to Akwasi. And Akwasi wrote to me and said, this is exciting. You are helping us to think outside of the box. Then, of course, work, etc., took over. Then I came back to it now, but I came back to it not as a blog, but as a podcast. But also, I was frustrated with the sort of kind of thinking we have in Zimbabwe at the moment. You know, we are based in Zimbabwe, of course, with a regional posture. But the challenge of the Zimbabwe public space right now is it has narrowly framed its problems around an electoral solution or around a change in the political party that is supposed to govern. So I keep on posting the questions to say, what if that does not happen? What if there are other ways of making sure that we can progress? So as we're doing that, we're beginning to explore many alternatives, because what we're trying to do with the team behind the podcast is to say, let's create a reservoir or an archive of alternative suggestions or ideas that we can begin to think of. So we look at saying, what if we thought outside of the box around youth unemployment? What could be the ideas? What if no one is coming to help us? What do we need to do as Africans? Because again, when you sit in a conversation with colleagues in civil society, at times the solution ends up being so and so has to help us. It's never about how we sort of deploy our agency towards resolving certain problems.
So, I mean, I've done lots of these conversations with different colleagues, and most of them, I have a personal relationship with them, and they've seen the kind of journeys that we have all traveled. But this is one of my most personal conversations that I'm having with you, because like I said in the beginning, I almost know each and everything about you, and you also know each and everything about me. One of the things that you said earlier about, you know, because of your mother's influence on the setting up of SIVIO, the majority of the leaders, the people at SIVIO are women. But I also know that there's another woman who probably is the biggest philanthropist in terms of SIVIO, and this is Regina. Every time I think about it, I get emotional, because if it wasn't for her, chances are SIVIO would not have survived.
True, very true.
I want us to just take that moment and appreciate the help that she has given.
Sure. Yeah, you know, there are partnerships, there are marriages, then there are partnerships. Regina has been, look, she's a force, and people misunderstand Regina because she's a very quiet person. So people don't understand how strong-willed she is. And as you're saying, that if it had not been for her, one of the things that would have quickly happened, because during the time I decided to set up SIVIO Institute, then I got to the US for a fellowship, we get 3 good job offers. And all of them, Regina says, no, we're doing SIVIO. When we come back home to now set, we ran for close to 18 months with no salary for me. And we're literally living off her salary, etc. But it's just not me as Tendai being looked after by my wife, but it's also SIVIO Institute being looked after by Regina. Because she actually at times donates all your consultants' incomes towards making sure that SIVIO continues. So you're very right. She is the, well, we may say it's named after my mother, but she is actually the force that makes us accountable even beyond the board. Because I have to make sure that it's a success. Because she has entrusted me to say, I can pursue this vision. Because if it was somebody else, she could have been impatient and just challenged me to get a job and get on with it.
I mean, earlier we did an interview with Mhlanga Records Foundation, which is set up by just 2 young people. And here we are with you having set up SIVIO. And most people might not see the importance of this because we look at the big foundations that have been named after specific individuals, whether internationally or locally. But for me, the beauty of what SIVIO and others are doing is to demonstrate that it's actually possible to set up something, run it professionally, but also have a public impact. The work that SIVIO has been doing has actually not just been in the space of philanthropy, but also in governance circles.
Yeah.
I remember one time an article that came out where the report had come out in terms around of, I think it was around the perceptions of citizens on how the government is doing. And you were summoned to explain what's going on. so there's already an impact that is happening, but the essence is that it comes from a particular situation. It involves family resources, but for public for public good and public interest. I really wanted us to pay tribute to some of the work that really comes and at times can go unnoticed on this podcast. And that's why I'm saying for me this is one of the most personal conversations that I'm having with you.
Yeah, we were both scared of doing it, right? Afraid of doing it because it takes us through this path. Yeah, I think we've never taken institution building seriously on the continent because we've always assumed somebody should fund us to do things. And I'm not saying SIVIO is, at the moment, SIVIO depends 80% or so on donor funding. But we've been very careful to make sure that we are also contributing to this long-term sustainability, etc. And we've been very, very deliberate or intentional about making sure that at some point we want to make sure that our own income is bigger than donor contributions. So it's, at the moment, you being the board chair, etc., at the moment, we are trying to make sure that we move towards what we may call a social enterprise posture, where we actually create resilience incomes that helps us to do that. But also, you can never do this work by yourself. There have been a lot of people. This is what we always say, that it takes a village to raise a child. It also takes a village to raise an organization. And we've been very we've benefited from local philanthropists emerging and established, friends, family, and also just the goodwill. Just the goodwill, people dropping your name in the right places, etc. That's what makes SIVIO what it is today. And I always say that I'm always pleasantly surprised when I go out of the offices and I meet people and they tell us of the good work we're doing, because I think I'm the biggest critique of the organization, because I still think there could be more we're doing, but etc. But we're grateful for where we are, and we're grateful for the opportunities that we've so far come across and what lies ahead of us.
Thank you so much, Tendai, for taking the time. Like you said, we've been dilly-dallying around doing this conversation because of the interpersonal relationships, but also the journeys that we have both traveled. But finally, we have done it. But I don't think we have really, I think we have just scratched the surface when it comes to the work that you do and some of the impact that you have made as a person. So I personally want to thank you also for supporting CAPSI. You do research, you partner with us on doing research, but you also teach in our modules. So thank you so much. I'm sure at some point we'll come back again and have another discussion around this. That was Tendai Murisa, currently the Executive Director of SIVIO Institute, based in Harare, Zimbabwe. Thank you for watching. See you next time.
You've been listening to the CAPSI podcast series, Conversations on African Philanthropy.